Today, I have a special guest with us in the studio, and someone I've been looking forward to have on the show for a long time. Kevin Anderson, an internationally acclaimed climate researcher and speaker who tells it like it is. Join us for an inspiring conversation. This is the Evolution Show. Welcome to the Evolution Show. I'm your host, Johan Landgren. The Evolution Show is all about connecting the dots to see the bigger picture and address some of the biggest challenges and opportunities of our time. And with us today, we have an acclaimed international climate researcher, Kevin Anderson. And he's going to tell us how it is. Plain and simple. Welcome to the Evolution Show, Kevin.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, you're here in Uppsala again.
I am, yes. I previously was here as the Zenström professor at the university here, but now my time as the Zenström professor has come to an end. You're only able to do a 2-year post, but I have a continued guest professorship at the university, so I have continual links with colleagues here at the Centre for Environment and Development.
Yeah, and as I said, you're known to say it as it is. You stick to the facts, but I think we're going to come back to that, but that's something I really like with you. I've seen so many interviews and so on, and and so I thought we can start with your background because it's quite interesting. You have a background with a lot of experience in the oil industry as well, which is perhaps something you won't think about when you think about a climate researcher, but maybe that's a benefit as well. We'll see what you're going to tell us. But currently, you're professor in energy and climate research at the Tyndall Center.
Yes, at the University of Manchester. Yes,
but can you tell us a little bit about your background, perhaps, before you became a climate researcher, and kind of why you are so outspoken about the climate as you are?
Yeah, okay. Well, actually, I left school at 16 and did an apprenticeship. So I spent 5 years working in the merchant navy, training as an engineer to work on ships' engines, which I absolutely love, and in retrospect, probably think I wish I'd never left. So I did that, and then later on I went to university and did a degree in mechanical engineering, which is a sort of follow-up to what I've been doing in the merchant navy in many respects. And then whilst I was doing my engineering degree, I was increasingly interested in environmental issues, which I had been as a child as well. I was brought up in the countryside, so I always had this sort of interest in nature. I never really thought it was environmental or anything like that. It's just nature. I liked being in and around nature, and a lot of my hobbies, rock climbing and fell running and so forth, were related to that as well. And so I was interested in environmental issues when I was actually at university. What can engineers do to help? I then left the university and went to work in the oil industry. And bear in mind, this was before the climate change issue became before climate change became a big issue. And I was working on the oil platforms, and I was trying to identify environmental problems to do with CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons, and pollution in terms of spills into the water. So I was trying to sort of change protocols offshore to make the whole practice much more environmentally sound. And during that period, climate change became a really big issue. So I went back to university to think, I need to find out more about climate change. And I sort of effectively stayed on from then, did my master's and then my PhD, and then I remained really as a climate academic ever since. But having that background in the oil industry is really helpful. And also just having come from an engineering apprenticeship background, have a better understanding of what it's like to try and fix things, to do things, to make things, to put things in place, which is so different from what you see in the textbooks. And you say that I'm outspoken, but I don't see myself as outspoken, and my job as an academic is to say it as I see it, is to do my work carefully and meticulously, and recognise that sometimes we get things wrong, but hopefully not too often, and then just communicate my results bluntly. As I say, it's not my job to concern myself with political and economic sensibilities. That's for other people to do. That's for policymakers or consultants or the journalists. It's not for us as academics. We should never shy away from being blunt and honest about our findings. So I don't see myself as outspoken. I just see myself as an academic. Yeah,
and it's a good point. I think a lot of times you have researchers, they're working on the kind of their own isolated cases, or they're not sharing perhaps what their conclusions are to the public sometimes. And they share it with your academic colleagues and so on, but the layman or the the public, perhaps they don't know it. And I think perhaps that's more what you do, that you share the experience you have, the research you have, in a way. You frame it also in a way, I think, that people can understand it. And that's really important in the times we have now, where you have like you questioning everything and things like that. Yeah.
But I think there's another point there, though. I think that is true to some extent, but in areas of academic activity that have a strong political dimension, not party political, but with a small p, I think there's a real tendency for academics to toe a certain line. And so I think in climate change, it's not that they're just talking to each other, it's actually that they're often saying things that their own research doesn't really suggest are true, because they're trying to hold a political position or a particular economic view. And I have a deep concern that as academics working on climate change, a lot of people, either through their silence, are being very political by supporting the status quo, or actively saying things that privately they will tell me and others they don't believe in.
No.
And I think that again is not the role of academics.
No. Yeah. And just to mention as well, you have been an advisor as well to the UK government.
Yes, I provide advice on all sorts of issues over quite a long period of time, but then many other academics do as well.
Yeah, okay, that's true. And also the European Commission.
Yes,
mention.
We were there recently talking about some biofuel issues, actually.
Yeah. Do they listen, do you think, when you...
Certainly. I think a lot of the time, to be blunt, I think everywhere you go, whether it's in companies, whether it's in the policy realm or civil society, everywhere I go, people do listen and often are very deeply interested in these issues, but they always claim it's other groups that can't deal with this. So you often get it's the policymakers say, well, we would make the changes, but the public don't really understand it. Or the public at civil society meetings say, well, we want these changes, but the policymakers aren't making it. And so you hear this, everyone's sort of thinking other groups aren't on board with these issues. But overall, actually, I'm surprised the degree of alignment there is between different groups that we need to do something urgent on climate change.
Yeah, and actually, how I came to know about you was actually I was asked to. They knew that I was interested, and I didn't fly at the time. I think I stopped flying around 2015 or something. 2015, and in 2017, I was approached when I heard about that Malena Enman and a bunch of others, and you were leading sort of that article. I think you maybe came up with the idea. So we wrote an article. I was one of the signatories of that article about stop flying or encouraging not flying. And there was artists, writers, and of course you as a researcher, climate researcher. That was published in Dagens Nyheter's biggest Swedish newspaper in Sweden. And I think a lot of people read that, actually. They got some energy from that, and they were inspired, I think. And a lot of people, of course, they said that this is just, how can I do this? It's impossible, and so on. But I thought when I describe to people, I encourage them to try and think about it at least. I'm not pushing everyone. I realize that some people, they won't take that step and can't take that step perhaps, but the ones that can, they sometimes only need some encouragement. So I think that was a great idea, and I'm happy that I was one of them that could contribute a little bit to that. And to you, of course, you're not flying. You haven't been flying for a long time. How long is it?
2004 was the last time I flew, but I tried to stop flying in 2002, but that was my last work flight. But my mother had breast cancer, and her brother lives in Australia, and she'd had some treatment, and she wanted sort of the last time to go and see him. So she wasn't able to go on her own, so I agreed to go with her. So that was the last time I flew, which was 2004. But I often say I don't really have a no-fly policy. I would fly if something I felt was really important and urgent, and I haven't had that since 2004. But I'm obviously surrounded by lots of academic colleagues who think that their work is so deeply important that they feel they should regularly be on a plane. So I think we have to make that judgment ourselves, but I'm certainly questioning of some of their judgments as to how often they fly, and to think that they are the ones with the pearls of wisdom that they should bestow on the little people beneath them as they fly around the world does leave me a little concerned sometimes. Yeah.
Recently, I actually almost a year ago now, I read this fantastic book by Malena Enman, the whole story about how tough it was for them and everything. For those who don't know, Malena Enman is the mother of Greta Thunberg. And also Svante, of course, who was also reading this book. And they mentioned you in the book, actually, and I thought it was so interesting. I encourage people to read it. There is a new title also in English.
There is, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and it's called Our House is on Fire. So I encourage people to read that as well. But the interesting thing, I think, in the book they mentioned that you have educated them, and they have learned a lot of things from you as a researcher. And if you know anything about Greta, for people, it's like she wants to check her facts. So and you are a person who's really checking your facts, and you're framing it in a way I think that is great. And today, my idea is that we talk about the challenges we face when it comes to the climate crisis. And in this second part of this conversation, we look more into how we can possibly reverse the climate crisis. So, but we'll probably mention how we can solve them today as well, but more focused on that in the second part. And so today I would like to start with some of the vital facts, because we have to face them and realize, and you're really clear about that. If you're not realistic about the challenge we have, you can't address them in a real way. So I would like to start by talking about your research. You've mentioned in your research that we have little to no chance of maintaining the rise in global mean surface temperature at below 2 degrees, despite repeated high-level statements to the contrary. And that 2 degree now more appropriately represents the threshold between dangerous and extremely dangerous climate change. Do you think we still are on this path? That's my question, part of my question. And could you explain what you mean with this when you... Yeah.
Well, I think we're on a path for well over 2 degrees centigrade. But prior to the Paris Agreement on climate change in 2015, there was a sort of general agreement, but it was never formalized quite to the same way it was in Paris, but about staying below 2 degrees. And as this was sort of the threshold between what was broadly thought to be politically acceptable sets of impacts and ones that were unacceptable. But that in itself was actually very dangerous, because who are the ones that determines what are the acceptable sets of impacts? You know, it's typically northern wealthy countries with very high emissions, with a little bit of engagement from poorer countries that are going to suffer the implications of the emissions from wealthy parts of the world. So 2 degrees C, as I saw it, was very, almost like quite a colonial framing of climate change. Because we thought we'd be okay, and we didn't really care that much about poorer people elsewhere, or indeed, for that matter, the future for our own children. But the Paris Agreement was interesting because there was obviously increased influence from some of the poorer parts of the world coming together and pushing for this 1.5 degrees C framing. Now, as I made the point then, I think there's little to no chance of us staying below 2, but the little is really important in that, because the little isn't just, let's just hope we do, that we mobilize that possibility by actually making some change. So whilst that sounds, well, is it worth doing anything? It's absolutely, we should do everything we can, because I think there's still an outside chance that we can hold to 2 degrees centigrade of warming. But I think it's fair to say my assessment would be, and indeed I know many other colleagues, many of them wouldn't say this publicly, but they certainly say it privately, that they don't think we can hold to 1.5. And whilst I'm really pleased, and this has taken me a while to come to this position, I'm pleased that there are many people pushing for this politically. I cannot see how you could actually deliver. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we could deliver on 1.5. But I really don't see any way to do that at the moment. I do see ways that we can just about deliver on 2 degrees centigrade of warming. And let's also be clear, because it doesn't sound too much in Sweden, 2 degrees centigrade, or in Manchester, 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. These are huge changes in the climate. We've seen about 1 degree variation over the last 10,000 years. So about over all sort of modern human time, we've only ever seen about 1 degree C change. And we've already seen 1 degree now already from what we've done in pretty much the last 100 years. And we're heading towards 2, which is something like 6 degrees difference in the poles, huge variations in the weather patterns, in rainfall, and therefore in agriculture, in movements of pests and diseases. So this is a huge shift in how our planet operates, how life on the planet operates, occurring in almost no time at all. Remember that the evolution usually progresses over hundreds and thousands of years, and we're here talking about within 100 years seeing huge changes. So this is 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade is a huge issue. Yeah,
and I can mention that I remember a really interesting presentation actually of Elon Musk before Paris UN conference, and he mentioned that even 0.1 degree could be like the collapse of an ecosystem. So even if we mention, as you said, half degree there and 1 degree here, we shouldn't look at it like that. We should look at how does perhaps a little bit, only like 0.1 or something, affect a region in an area, which in turn can affect some other ecosystem, and so on and so on. So it's easy, I think, if you don't put these degrees in a context, it's hard to grasp, I think. So yeah, and just on the same note as we talked here, that you all have also said during a seminar I read in the COP23 in Bonn, you said that it's a 95% chance that we go to hell in a handcart and we'll go to 4 degrees, but there is a 5% chance we can succeed, and that is up to us. And it's basically what you said there, but I think it's good to point that out, that you want to be realistic, but at the same time tell us that we have this 5% perhaps as a number. Yeah, it's a number, but it's just those probabilities are just a guide. My impression is that everything I see around me, and perhaps in fact since Bonn there are a few slightly more positive signs, but certainly up to Bonn, everything I'd seen around me looked like we had very, very little chance, because we were not prepared to really grasp the scale of the challenge. But there was a small 5%, there or thereabouts. That's what it felt like to me. And perhaps that's increased a little bit now, but still it's very similar. Yeah. But if we know what we're facing, and if we have to really put in, like, the house is on fire, basically, put that kind of mindset into this, it's possible to do a lot of super big things to mobilize. But if we don't think that it's here and now, it's 20, 30 years in front of us, it's easy to lay back and wait for some technological breakthrough and so on. So I guess that was your point. It very much so. And that's what we have, of course, been doing. The first report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out in 1990, almost 30 years ago, and we've done nothing but watch emissions rise. They're now almost 67% higher this year than they were in 1990. So we have failed for 30 years, and we have to be absolutely clear about that. And that's quite depressing for people that have tried hard. And then sometimes I've heard people say, well, that really sort of makes us think, well, was it worth doing anything? But of course it is worth doing things, and even when we fail, it's still worth trying. But I think we have to be honest about when you use the absolute measures, we have fundamentally failed. And it's not just let's blame India and China. The wealthy parts of the world that are responsible for most of the historical emissions still have not got their own house in order. Our emissions are still not going down in wealthy parts of the world. Only when you massage the statistics do you start to get some sort of slightly more positive sounding results. But looking at the full account of our carbon-rich lifestyles, you see no reductions in emissions in even the wealthier, more climate-progressive parts of the world, or hardly any reductions at all. Yeah, we'll come back to the issue of equity, which is vital here. I just mentioned also that for people, they want to have something concrete. So you have mentioned that we have to work with the next 5 years. You said 1 year ago, so it's 4 years. But the next years, not decades. And that's what the time we have. Yeah. And that's an important message, I think, for people to realize. As hard as it is to hear, it is also important to hear it, because then it means that we have to do it now. Yeah, certainly now. And it's not even there. It's not saying we can wait for 5 years. No. Every year we're putting out from total carbon dioxide emissions, we're putting out about 43 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Yeah. And from the science, we have a pretty good idea, with a bit of uncertainty, but pretty good idea of how much carbon dioxide we can put in the atmosphere from all of our activities if we want to stay below 2 degrees centigrade. And when you link those two together, actually what we're doing now, every year we're making it much more difficult because we're not controlling our emissions. So it's what we do this year and next year and the year after. But within 5 years from now, if we've done nothing at all, then we've pretty much knocked any chance of 2 degrees centigrade out of the window. Yeah, and just to mention the people that last year, the global emissions, they grew by 1.4%. Following a record increase in fossil world consumption, primarily in China and US. And for me, looking at it, is especially worrisome that we use so much natural gas, which was increased by 8.7%, which I think was the highest since the 80s in terms of an annual increase. And it came primarily from shale gas production. And if you look at the research I read at the Cornell University, they are questioning how much actually, that it might be much more, that is coming from not only from flaring but from leakage and so on. Yes. So it might be even higher than the numbers we have today suggests. So to moving, just my point is, I guess you think that Do you share the view that natural gas is presented as a cleaner alternative, but it might be at least as bad or even worse than, for example, coal, if you conclude everything?
Yeah, I would probably say I did think it's very unlikely it'll be worse than coal. And it depends quite how you measure the impacts of methane. Nevertheless, it is not a clean fuel. Let's be absolutely clear about this. Natural gas is a fossil fuel. If you had a kilogram of natural gas, 75% of that, 750 grams, would be carbon. So when you burn natural gas, you get a lot of carbon dioxide. So it is not a replacement for coal, and I think it's wrong to see it as a substitution, because if you go from coal to natural gas, then you're locking in ongoing natural gas use, ongoing very high carbon emissions for another 30 or 40 years. So gas is a high carbon fossil fuel. It's just not as high as coal. So we must move away from this language of it's better than. It's just less worse than coal.
Yeah,
and in terms of the emissions from the fugitive emissions, these other methane emissions, it is important to be aware that global concentrations of methane have been going up very significantly recently in the last few years, and it sort of correlates with the development of significantly more shale gas, but it isn't necessarily caused solely by shale gas. It could be that the warming we are seeing already around the globe means we're seeing more what we call biogenic activity, more activity in the sort of in nature, if you like, and that's giving rise to more methane. So as things warm up, you see more methane activity, more methane emitted. So there's a combination of factors, one of which is likely to be the fossil fuel industry.
I saw in a recent presentation you held in Scotland where you described some of the most common CO2 emissions measures as a litany of technocratic fraud. And I thought it was kind of funny. You're pointing to emissions trading and afforestation and partial accounting and so on. Could you elaborate on some of these, what you meant?
Yes, spindlery, I think is used. Is that the word in Swedish?
Yeah.
Something. Perhaps the pronunciation is wrong, but yes, I mean, just go through a few of these. Well, offsetting, when rather than generally it's high emissions people choosing to ask someone else in the poor parts of the world and pay them a few kroner to make reductions in their emissions to allow us to carry on our high emission lifestyle. So it's like trying to lose weight by asking someone else to cut back on the chocolate. It's not going to work. But then governments do that through something called the Clean Development Mechanism. So it's like a state-sanctioned offsetting. So rich countries can say, well, we're okay because we're going to pay poorer countries to reduce their emissions in some way. So there's some transfer of monies. Now this is really problematic because we're continuing to lock in our high carbon lifestyles. But then we go beyond that. We got the emissions trading scheme, which we've had in the EU, which in theory could have been quite a good scheme, but we had so many permits issued that the price of carbon was made so incredibly low that it had very little impact in driving reductions in emissions in line with Paris. Nothing like it at all. And then we have this idea now that we'll plant more and more trees, and we see this increasingly in some of the scenarios. We'll plant more trees, and that means we can carry on with the airport expansion and so forth. And I've heard that argument being made here in Sweden for expanding Arlanda airport, and you plant more trees in the north. Now again, trees are fine. We should be planting them for good tree reasons, for biodiversity reasons, for forestry reasons, and so forth. And it certainly can be part of the picture, but we must not use that as an excuse for continuing to lock in ongoing fossil fuel use. We do not know in the longer term what will happen to these trees, whether if the climate changes they'll be suitable anymore, whether the pests will move in and kill them, whether they get chopped down and used for firewood, whether they end up rotting in damp environments and producing more methane. So the whole suite of issues is why trees are not a substitution for cutting back our emissions. And then after that, we're relying on sort of negative emissions, which don't exist at the moment, whereby our children will refine and deploy technologies which do not exist today really in any scale to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Yeah. And even that one we think will fail. When you talk to a lot of the modelers, we don't think we can deliver what's in the model. So at every single level we see this list of what I would call fraud, because at the end of it we haven't reduced our carbon dioxide.
We'll come back to sucking away everything. But it's it's good that you mention it. But if we look at, and I would also like to mention when you talk about trees that it's easy to talk about carbon neutral trees and so on, but you discount the effect of, you have to grow the tree, and up to maybe when it's 20 years or something, then we can talk about that it's actually storing something. Before that it's insignificant basically, unless you're perhaps growing hemp and so on. But to come back to that, that's a fantastic thing that we might working with in the future that could at least store and grow fast.
But I mean, my take on this, and indeed some colleagues at the Tyndall Centre in Manchester and some of the ones here in CMUS, is that by and large, yes, let's do these things. Let's use these sort of natural sequestration techniques of one sort or another. But let's use them to offset the warming, particularly from agriculture, because we can never eliminate all of the emissions from agriculture. We can certainly reduce them significantly, methane and N2O emissions, but we can't eliminate them, unlike energy emissions where we can eliminate carbon dioxide. So there will be some ongoing warming from agricultural emissions. And there, I think, perhaps then these natural sequestration techniques can be used to compensate for that. But we're using them already to compensate for ongoing energy emissions and for locking in ever more expansion of ongoing high fossil fuel industries.
Yeah, and I would like to come back to equity question. I mean, it's vital, and we have to address it in different ways. It's not only an ethical matter; it's also a matter of addressing, making it the most effective measures that we can take. Because different measures in different areas, depending on if you're a big polluter or not, if you're a big population or not. So I would like to just come back to, since you're a petroleum, you have a petroleum engineering background, kind of. I would like to mention, it's just a coincidence actually, but the petroleum professor Ted Patzek is also a writer and I mean, he's an environmentalist, I would say, in many ways. He did a calculation where he looked at different, he compared basically US, Europe, and the average Chinese, how much energy they use, and if you calculate that, translate that into their body, how big body they would have to be to represent that kind of energy use, fossil use, everything from transportation to make the food and everything. Then the average American citizen would have to be a 40-ton sperm whale. And I'm talking like everything from a child to a grown-up. It's the average person. And then similarly, an average European had to be the size of a killer whale. So that would be like, something like 15, or actually 8 tons or something like that. And then the average Chinese or Asian, Chinese actually, it would have to be like a 350 kilos dolphin. Bottlenecked dolphin. So the differences are quite big between different areas in the world. So you can't say that, for example, if you take the same measure in China, will have the same effect in the US. I mean, in the US they drive 2 or 3 cars, for example, and per capita use is much higher. So that's one part of it. I think we have to realize that if we have to work with the most effective measures in the short time, as you said, 4 years, we have to look first, where can we make these kind of quick fixes, if you would call that, to have the biggest effect. So, and then, okay, of course, the ethical one is the other part of it. I mean, according to Oxfam study from 2015, the richest 1% in the world, they emit 30 times more carbon per capita than the poorest 50%. And compared to the in 175 times more than the poorest 10%. So I guess this is one of the biggest obstacles when we have different countries trying to negotiate to have a common kind of carbon emission standard. So how can we work around this? I mean, both kind of addressing the efficiency side of it and the ethical side of it. In this kind of short frame we have, 4 years or something. Yeah,
I mean, remember when I said the 4 years is about, is this the time frame where our emissions, if we don't stop them, then we'll probably put so much in the atmosphere that we will have locked in 2 degrees centigrade of warming. So it's not that 2 degrees centigrade won't occur in those 4 years. It takes a while to do that, but we'll have locked in that level of warming and made it impossible for us to mitigate and fast enough after that. But there are 2 ways of looking at this. One is, should it be done at the national level? I think that's really important because that's where levels of governance are. So you can think about how do governments engage in this issue. But also, I think the interesting work that underpinned that those Oxfam numbers you referred to was carried out by Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty in 2015, called, I think it's Carbon Inequality Report, or Carbon Inequality Report. And I really recommend people to look at that, 2015 by Chancel and Piketty. And there they went into sort of some fairly deep analysis as to where the emissions come from. And so about 2/3 of the top 10% of emitters are in the wealthy parts of the world and 1/3 in the poorer parts of the world. So there are still plenty of rich Chinese and Indians and people from different countries on the continent of Africa who are also significant emitters. like there are in the OECD countries as well, in the wealthier countries. So there were one way to think of it, well, look, who are the high emitters? But the other way, and I think both of these are really useful, is actually, but it's nation states, it's the governments that set the rules. So to me, if we are serious about climate change, the carbon budget framework, which is sort of comes out of the science, if you like, which says how much carbon can we emit at a global level, there or thereabouts, if we want to stay within, say, 2 degrees centigrade of warming, then the argument then is, well, how do you divide that up amongst countries? Now, I don't think that's an insurmountable task. The problem is that every country wants more than it's really entitled to. And that's what we saw in Paris. When you asked every country, what are you going to do? And you add them all up, you're talking about somewhere 3 degrees, say, or something like that, possibly a little bit more. And so when every country says what it's going to do, it's not enough. So we've got to find some fair way to get some sort of agreement between nations to say, well, what would our carbon budget look like? Now, there are ways to do that. They're challenging, but I think once we've done that, and that's not an easy thing, that's a huge challenge, then I think it's actually up to national governments as to how they deliver that within their own countries. So if you're within the sort of the European Union countries, then I think probably we will use particular rules of fairness that we deem are fair, and other parts of the world may use other ones that are more culturally specific to them. So I think we have to be quite careful not to impose sort of colonial rules on other parts of the world as to how they should stay within their carbon budgets. The Chinese will do it different to the Ghanaians. The Ghanaians will do it different to the US. The Swedish will do it different to the UK. We all play out the policies within our own cultural, environmental, economic framing. And so I think, therefore, these sort of universal ways to solve these problems, I think, is probably not helpful. But nevertheless, the framing of the carbon budgets to nations, I think, is absolutely key. And until we're prepared to recognise that, then I think we'll continue to fail, because when you add up everyone's commitments, it will never be enough to hold us to anything like 2 degrees centigrade.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think it's also good to mention Sweden here, because a lot of people have the perspective and idea, perhaps at least outside Sweden, that we're a rich and technologically advanced country, but then we also have a huge responsibility. But when you talk to people around the world, I think that Sweden is like a huge leader when it comes to sustainability and so on. But if, for example, World Wildlife Conservation, they have looked at Swedish average consumption per capita, and we live as we had 4.5 planets here. And it's basically because we import a lot of products, we consume a lot of products, we travel the world. More than ever in Sweden, and it's so cheap now to fly that it's I looked the other day, it's what is it in American dollar? It's like 4,000 or 5,000 Swedish crowns to go to from Arlanda to San Francisco, so half around the world in no money at all. And of course, it's tempting for people. So, but why do you? Also, what's your reaction when you came to Sweden and in bearing this in mind, why do you think we have failed so much in Sweden? Why is this perception of Swedens that we are leading the way when we obviously are not?
No, I mean, I think it's fair to say that certainly in the wealthy parts of the world, no country is leading the way. I mean, there are some examples out there, perhaps, where you can see elements of success. If you look at, say, some elements, maybe Costa Rica or Cuba, often, in fact, not the usual suspects. You see elements of success in some of their societies about living good quality lives, at least in some respects, and also being low emissions. I'm not saying that these countries are in any way perfect, nothing very far from it. But actually, when you look to the sort of wealthier parts of the world, there are very few examples of countries that are really succeeding, and Sweden is not succeeding on climate change. And I have to say, as someone who's come from the UK to here, what I found interesting is that I think in terms of the engagement on climate change, I think the UK is actually well ahead of Sweden. That doesn't mean to say we're getting our emissions down, but I was really quite surprised as a country that is much more wedded to issues of sustainability than the UK, very clearly, and is a much more egalitarian society, and I think in much respects a much fairer society that is happier with itself than the UK. Nevertheless, when it came to climate change, I was really quite surprised that it hasn't developed further than it has done. And I'll go even further and say that the new climate change law that's been developed in Sweden, which the Swedish Parliament is saying how wonderful this is, I think this is not even as good as the 2008 Climate Change Act in the UK. And I'm saying this as someone who's not normally that positive about the UK. So I think Sweden has not only failed on climate change significantly, as have virtually all other nations, but indeed what I find really worrying is that its legislation is now put in place is actually far, far too weak and well behind that was even locked into the UK in 2008. And that's a real concern, that the Swedish government, one of the most progressive countries in Europe, and I would think fairly fair to say, one of the progressive countries in the world, has locked in a sort of 20th century view of climate change to try and solve a 21st century problem. So that is a really sad indictment of the Swedish parliamentary system and of civil society there in failing to push it further.
Yeah, we need to get our acts together. But so then my kind of last question here is that when people hear about climate change, they often react either with denial or simply they don't think it will affect them significantly in their lifetime. Other ones, they want to change, but they don't know where to start, or if it really makes any difference what they do. So do you have any advice to people that feel this kind of hopelessness or even are in the denial phase?
Well, let's part of the denial phase. I mean, there are, yes, the challenge is huge, but there are certainly things that we can do, and we cannot wait for some benevolent dictator or the Musks of this world or the Gates of this world. These are not going to solve climate change. It will emerge from a sort of a messy relationship between top down and bottom up. We all have a role to play here, and when I say for individuals, we need to identify our own sort of high carbon aspects of our lives and change them. Now, in isolation, that doesn't really matter. To be blunt, the emissions from most people, even the relatively high emitters, in isolation don't matter. The point about changing them is that we can then start a dialogue with our friends, our colleagues, the friends we've got at the sports club with, or whatever else we do in our lives, and even some of our work colleagues. We start a dialogue about, well, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? How are you doing it? Is it easy? Is it difficult? What are the problems? So you open this debate. But to do that, you need to make the changes and see what it's like and demonstrate you can do that. But we then also need to engage within our companies, within our universities, within our schools, within our local councils, and using the local media. Say, what can we do locally? So, why doesn't the university start to really drive a low carbon agenda here in Uppsala that it can push hard across the land, across the commune, to say that these are the sorts of things we need to be doing more widely. But then we also, as individuals, I think, need to engage with the national policymakers. Write to them, email them, contact them, tweet about them. But be courteously critical when they do things that are not appropriate, but also be supportive when they are making the right sort of move. So we need to engage as careful citizens. There is a role in democracy for citizens to engage. It's not just about getting to vote every few years. And policymakers will respond to people engaging with them. So at every level, as local individuals talking with our friends and family, as people in our local environment, and people who are citizens in a national democracy, there are roles for us to play. And without us playing out those roles, how do we expect other people to ever know what we should be doing? So we all have that role to play.
Yeah, I agree. And I think encouragement and inspiration, everything from your neighbor to, contacting your politician can have a huge impact. Small things, connecting the dots in the big end, the butterfly creating a storm.
Even a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl can have an impact.
Oh, yes. And thank you so much for this important conversation. I hope people listened and to Kevin's message, which I would summarize that we can fix it. We can fix this. We have only years, not decades, to change, and that it requires that we all contribute, big or small, and collaborate, and that every kilogram of carbon that is not emitted matters. That's, I think, important message also. If you have, thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
If you were inspired as well, feel free to continue the conversation in the comments below. In the next episode, we'll continue the conversation with Kevin Andersson. We'll look more into how we can look at the solutions, how we can reverse the climate crisis. As always, we appreciate your feedback. Was it good or bad? If you want to see the videos as soon as they come out, consider subscribing. I hope to see you on Monday in the next episode.